Welcome back to Footnotes and Folly. I am Pemberton, this is part 34. Now Josephus brings us to the last act and the most famous in all his work, Masada. Flavius Silva gathers his army against the one fortress still in rebellion, a sheer desert rock above the Dead Sea, held by VIII and the Sicarii. Silva walls them in and raises a vast bank and tower against the single point the rock allows, until the wall is breached and the end is certain. And there, on that last night, Elisa rises and speaks twice to persuade 960 men, with their wives and children, that a free death is better than Roman slavery and the abuse of their families. Let us go on.
When Betook died in Judea, Flavius Silva succeeded him as procurator there. Seeing that all the rest of the country had been subdued in this war, and that only one stronghold still remained in rebellion, he gathered together all his army, which lay in different places, and made an expedition against it. This fortress was called Masada. It had been seized by Eleazar, a powerful man, and the commander of the Sicarii. He was a descendant of that Judas who, as we have related before, had persuaded many Jews not to submit to the taxation when Cyrenius was sent into Judea to make one. At that time the Sicarii gathered together against those who were willing to submit to the Romans and treated them in every way as enemies. They plundered their possessions, drove away their cattle, and set fire to their houses. They said that such men were no different from foreigners, because they so cowardly betrayed the freedom for which Jews thought it worthwhile to struggle to the utmost, and because they admitted that they preferred slavery under the Romans to such a struggle. In truth, however, this was nothing more than a pretense and a cover for the cruelty they practiced, and a way to disguise their own greed, which they later made clear by their actions. Those who shared in their rebellion also joined them in the war against the Romans, and went still farther with them in their shameless undertakings against Rome. When they were again convicted of hypocrisy in these claims, they abused even more fiercely those who justly reproached them for their wickedness. Indeed, that was a time exceedingly fertile in every kind of wicked practice. No sort of evil deed was left undone, nor could anyone even invent a new kind of bad action, so deeply were they all infected. They competed with one another, both as individuals and as communities, to see who could go farthest in impiety toward God and injustice toward their neighbors. The powerful men oppressed the multitude, and the multitude eagerly labored to destroy the powerful. One side desired to tyrannize over others, the other desired to use violence against others and plunder those richer than themselves. The Sicarii were the first to begin these transgressions, and the first to become barbarous toward those allied with them. They left no reproach unspoken, and no destructive act untried in order to ruin those touched by their plots. Yet John showed by his actions that these Sicarii were more moderate than he was. He not only killed all those who gave him good advice to do what was right, but treated them worst of all, as the bitterest enemies he had among all the citizens. He filled his whole country with 10,000 examples of wickedness, such as a man already hardened enough in impiety toward God would naturally commit. The food set upon his table was unlawful, and he rejected the purifications ordained by the law of his country. It was therefore no longer any wonder if a man so mad in impiety toward God observed no rules of gentleness or common affection toward men. Again, what mischief did Simon the son of Joras fail to do? What kind of abuse did he abstain from toward the very freemen who had set him up as tyrant? What friendship or kinship did not make him bolder in his daily murders? They considered doing harm only to strangers as a work beneath their courage, but thought that cruelty toward their nearest relations would be a glorious proof of it. The Idumeans also competed with these men to see who would be guilty of the greatest madness. These vile wretches cut the throats of the high priests so that no part of religious regard for God might remain. From there they proceeded to destroy utterly the last remains of civil government, and introduce the most complete scene of iniquity in every practicable form. Under this scene grew up those people called zealots, who truly answered to the name, for they imitated every wicked work. If memory suggested any evil thing formerly done, they eagerly pursued it. Although they took their name from zeal for what was good, it suited them only ironically, either because of those whom they unjustly treated through their wild and brutish disposition, or because they thought the greatest mischiefs were the greatest goods. Accordingly, they all met the ends that God deservedly brought upon them as punishment. Every misery that human nature can endure was sent upon them, until the end of their lives, and death came upon them in many kinds of torment. Yet one might rightly say that they suffered less than they had done to others, because it was impossible for them to be punished according to what they deserve. But this is not the proper place to lament according to the deserts of those who fell under the barbarity of these men. I therefore return again to the remaining part of the present narrative. The Roman general now came and led his army against Eleazar and the Sicarii who held the fortress Masada with him. He quickly gained control of the whole adjoining country and placed garrisons in the most suitable parts of it. He also built a wall entirely around the whole fortress, so that none of the besieged could easily escape, and he set men to guard its several parts. He pitched his camp in a place he had chosen as convenient for the siege, where the rock belonging to the fortress came nearest to the neighboring mountain. Yet even this place was difficult for obtaining plenty of provisions. Food had to be brought to the army from a great distance, with much labor by the Jews appointed to that task, and water also had to be brought to the camp, because the place had no nearby spring. After Silva had arranged these matters beforehand, he began the siege of the place, a siege likely to require much skill and labor because of the strength of the fortress. I will now describe its nature. There was a rock, not small in circumference and very high. It was surrounded by valleys descending to such vast depths that the eye could not reach their bottoms. They were steep and impossible for any animal to walk upon, except at 2 places where the rock slopes down enough to provide a passage upward, though still with difficulty. Of the roads that lead to it, one comes from the lake asphaltites toward the sunrise, and another lies on the west, where the ascent is easier. The first of these roads is called the Serpent because it resembles the animal in its narrowness and continual windings. It is broken off by the projecting precipices of the rock, turns back frequently upon itself, and then lengthens little by little, making its forward progress with great difficulty. Whoever walks along it must first set 1 foot forward, and then the other with care. If the feet slip, there is nothing but destruction, for on each side lies a vastly deep chasm and precipice, enough to overcome anyone's courage by the terror it puts into the mind. After a man has gone along this way for 30 furlongs, the rest is the top of the hill, which does not end in a small point, but is a plain on the highest part of the mountain. On this summit Jonathan the high priest first built a fortress and called it Masada. Afterward King Herod gave great attention to rebuilding the place. He built a wall around the entire top of the hill, 7 furlongs long, made of white stone, 12 cubits high and 8 cubits broad. On that wall were also erected 38 towers, each 50 cubits high. From these towers one could pass into smaller buildings built on the inside all around the wall. The king reserved the top of the hill, whose soil was rich and better for agriculture than that of any valley, so that those who committed themselves to this fortress for safety would not be entirely without food if they should ever lack supplies from outside. He also built a palace there at the western ascent, within and beneath the walls of the citadel, but inclining toward its north side. The wall of this palace was very high and strong, and at its 4 corners it had towers 60 cubits high. The furniture of the buildings, cloisters, and baths was highly varied and very costly. These buildings were supported on every side by pillars made of single stones. The walls and floors of the buildings were paved with stones of several colors. At every inhabited place, both above, around the palace, and before the wall, he had many large pits cut out of the rocks as reservoirs for water. By this arrangement he tried to provide water for several uses, as though there were springs there. There was also a road dug from the palace leading to the very top of the mountain, though it could not be seen by those outside the walls. Nor could enemies easily use the open roads. The eastern road, as already noted, could not be walked on because of its nature. As for the western road, Herod built a large tower at its narrowest point, no less than 1,000 cubits from the top of the hill. This tower could not possibly be passed by, nor could it easily be taken. Indeed, because of its construction, even those who walked along the road without fear could not easily reach its end. In this way the citadel was fortified both by nature and by human hands, so as to frustrate enemy attacks. The stores within this fortress were still more wonderful because of their splendor and how long they lasted. Large quantities of grain had been laid up there, enough to sustain men for a long time. There was also wine and oil in abundance, along with every kind of pulse and heaps of dates. Eleazar found all these when he and his Sicarii gained possession of the fortress by treachery. These fruits were fresh and fully ripe, in no way inferior to such fruits newly stored, although almost 100 years had passed from the time Herod laid in these provisions until the place was taken by the Romans. Indeed, when the Romans gained possession of the fruits that remained, they found that they had not spoiled during all that time. We would not be mistaken if we supposed the air was the cause of their lasting so long, since the fortress was so high and so free from the mixture of all earthy and muddy particles of matter. A large quantity of every sort of weapon of war was also found there, treasured up by that king and sufficient for 10,000 men. There was cast iron, brass, and tin, showing that he had taken great pains to have everything ready there for the greatest emergencies. The report is that Herod prepared this fortress for himself as a refuge against 2 kinds of danger. One was fear of the multitude of the Jews, lest they depose him and restore their former kings to the government. The other danger was greater and more terrible, arising from Cleopatra, queen of Egypt. She did not conceal her intentions, but often spoke to Antony, asking him to kill Herod and begging him to give her the kingdom of Judea. It is certainly a great wonder that Antony never yielded to her commands in this matter, since he was so miserably enslaved by his passion for her. Nor would anyone have been surprised if she had been granted such a request. Fear of these dangers made Herod rebuild Masada, and by doing so he left it to be the finishing stroke of the Romans in this Jewish war. Since the Roman commander Silva had now built an outer wall all around the whole place, as already described, and had thereby taken the most careful measures to prevent any of the besieged from escaping, he began the siege itself. He found only one place suitable for the banks he needed to raise. Behind the tower that secured the road leading from the west to the palace and to the top of the hill, there was a certain rocky height, very broad and prominent, but 300 cubits below the highest part of Masada. It was called the White Promontory. Silva got onto that part of the rock and ordered the army to bring earth. When they set to work eagerly, and many of them worked together, the bank was raised and became solid to a height of 200 cubits. Yet this bank was not thought high enough for the engines that were to be placed upon it. So another elevated work, made of large stones fitted closely together, was raised on top of the bank. This structure was 50 cubits in both width and height. The other machines now prepared were like those first devised by Vespasian and afterward by Titus for sieges. There was also a tower 60 cubits high, plated all over with iron. From this tower the Romans threw darts and stones with their engines, and soon forced those who fought from the walls of the place to withdraw, preventing them from lifting their heads above the works. At the same time Silva ordered the great battering ram he had made to be brought there and set against the wall. He had it strike the wall repeatedly, and with some difficulty it broke down a section and completely overthrew it. However, the Sicarii, I hurried and immediately built another wall inside it, one that would not be exposed to the same fate from the machines as the first. This wall was soft and yielding, and so could avoid the terrible blows that had damaged the other. It was framed in this way. They laid together great wooden beams lengthwise, one close to the end of another, in the same direction in which they had been cut. There were 2 rows of these beams, parallel to each other and set apart by the required breadth of the wall, and the space between the rows was filled with earth. Then, so the earth would not fall away as the bank was raised higher, they laid other beams across them and bound together the beams that ran lengthwise. This work resembled a real building. When the machine struck it, the blows were weakened by its yielding, and as the materials were shaken by the impact, they were pressed closer together, so that the pile became firmer than before. When Silva saw this, he thought it best to try to take the wall by setting it on fire. So he ordered the soldiers to throw a great number of burning torches onto it. Since it was mostly made of wood, it quickly caught fire, and once it was burning, its hollow construction made the fire spread into a great flame. At the very beginning of this fire, a north wind that was then blowing proved dangerous to the Romans. By bringing the flame downward, it drove it toward them, and they were almost in despair of success, fearing that their engines would be burned. But then the wind suddenly shifted to the south, as if by divine providence. It blew strongly in the opposite direction, carried the flame back, and drove it against the wall, which was now burning through its whole thickness. The Romans, now having assistance from God, returned joyfully to their camp and resolved to attack their enemies the next day. That night they set their watch more carefully, lest any of the Jews escape from them without being discovered. Eleazar, however, did not once think of fleeing away, nor would he allow anyone else to do so. When he saw their wall burned down by the fire, and could devise no other way of escape and no further opportunity for their courage, he set before his eyes what the Romans would do to them, their children, and their wives if they got them into their power. He then considered having them all killed. Judging this to be the best thing they could do in their present circumstances, he gathered together the most courageous of his companions, and encouraged them to take that course in the following speech. Long ago, my noble friends, we resolved never to be servants to the Romans, nor to anyone except God himself, who alone is the true and just Lord of mankind. Time has now come that compels us to make that resolution true in practice. Let us not now bring reproach on ourselves by contradicting ourselves. Formerly we would not endure slavery even when it was without danger, but now, if the Romans reduce us under their power while we are alive, we must choose not only slavery but intolerable punishments along with it. We were the very first to revolt from them, and we are the last who still fight against them. I cannot help regarding it as a favor God has granted us that it is still in our power to die bravely, and in a state of freedom. This has not been the case for others who were conquered unexpectedly. It is very clear that we shall be taken within a day. Yet it remains possible to die in a glorious manner, together with our dearest friends. This is something our enemies cannot possibly prevent, though they very much desire to take us alive. Nor can we any longer hope to fight them and defeat them. It would indeed have been proper for us to recognize God's purpose much sooner, even from the beginning, when we were so eager to defend our liberty, and when we suffered such harsh treatment from one another and worse treatment from our enemies. We should have understood that the same God who in former times took the Jewish nation into his favor has now condemned it to destruction. If he had continued favorable, or had been displeased with us only in a lesser degree, he would not have overlooked the destruction of so many men, nor delivered his most holy city to be burned and demolished by our enemies. To be sure, we weakly hoped that we, and we alone, might still preserve ourselves in freedom, as though we ourselves had committed no sins against God, and had not shared in the sins of others, and as though we had taught other men to preserve their liberty. Therefore consider how God has shown us that our hopes were vain by bringing upon us the distress of this desperate condition, beyond all our expectations. The nature of this fortress, unconquerable in itself, has not become a means of deliverance for us. Even while we still have a great abundance of food, a great quantity of arms, and more other necessities than we need, God himself has openly deprived us of every hope of deliverance. The fire that was driven upon our enemies did not turn back of its own accord upon the wall we had built. This was the effect of God's anger against us for the many sins we have committed in a most insolent and extravagant way against our own countrymen. Let us therefore not receive the punishment for these sins from the Romans, but from God himself, carried out by our own hands, for that will be more moderate than what the Romans would do. Let our wives die before they are abused, and our children before they have tasted slavery. After we have killed them, Let us grant that glorious benefit to one another in turn, and preserve ourselves in freedom as an excellent funeral monument for us. But first let us destroy our money in the fortress by fire. I am well assured that this will be a great grief to the Romans, that they will not be able to seize our bodies, and will also fail to get our wealth. Let us spare nothing except our provisions, for they will testify after we are dead that we were not subdued for lack of necessities, but that, according to our original resolution, we preferred death before slavery. This was Eleazar's speech to them. Yet not everyone who heard it agreed with his opinion. Some were very eager to put his advice into practice, were almost filled with pleasure at it, and thought death was a good thing. Those who were weaker felt pity for their wives and families. Since these men were especially moved by the prospect of their own certain death, they looked wistfully at one another, and the tears in their eyes showed that they disagreed with his judgment. When Eleazar saw these people in such fear, and saw that their souls were cast down by so extraordinary a proposal, he feared that these weaker men, by their lamentations and tears, might weaken those who had heard his words courageously. So he did not stop exhorting them. Instead, he stirred himself up, gathered suitable arguments to raise their courage, and began to speak to them more vigorously and fully about the immortality of the soul. He gave a sorrowful groan, fixed his eyes intently on those who were weeping, and spoke as follows. Truly, I was greatly mistaken when I thought I was helping brave men who struggled hard for their liberty, men resolved either to live with honor or to die. I find instead that you are no better than others, either in virtue or in courage, and that you are afraid of dying, though death will deliver you from the greatest miseries. You ought to make no delay in this matter, nor wait for anyone to give you good advice. From ancient times, as soon as we could use our reason, the laws of our country and of God himself have continually taught us, and our forefathers have confirmed the same teaching by their actions and by their brave minds, that life, not death, is the calamity for men. Death gives our souls liberty and sends them away to their own place of purity, where they are beyond all kinds of misery. While souls are tied down to a mortal body, they share in its miseries, and truly, to speak the truth, they are themselves dead, for the union of what is divine with what is mortal is unsuitable. It is true that the power of the soul is great even when it is imprisoned in a mortal body. By moving the body in an invisible way, it makes the body a sensible instrument and causes it to go farther in its actions than mortal nature could otherwise do. But when the soul is freed from the weight that drags it down to the earth and is joined to it, it gains its proper place. Then it shares in that blessed power and those abilities that can in no way be hindered in their operations. It remains invisible to the eyes of men, just as God himself is invisible. Certainly it is not seen while it is in the body, for it is there invisibly, and when it is freed from the body, it is still not seen. The soul has one nature, and that nature is incorruptible. Yet it is the cause of the change made in the body. Whatever the soul touches lives and flourishes, and whatever it leaves withers away and dies. Such is the degree of immortality within it. Let me present the state of sleep as the clearest proof of what I say. In sleep, when the body does not distract them, souls have the sweetest rest depending on themselves. Through their kinship with God, they converse with him. They then go everywhere and foretell many future things beforehand. Why then are we afraid of death, when we are pleased with the rest we have in sleep? How absurd it is to pursue liberty while we are alive and yet envy ourselves that liberty where will be eternal. We who have been brought up in our own discipline ought to become an example to others of our readiness to die. Yet if we need foreigners to support us in this matter, let us consider those Indians who profess the practice of philosophy. These good men endure the time of life only unwillingly. They regard it as a necessary servitude and hurry to release their souls from their bodies. Indeed, when no misfortune presses or drives them to it, they have such desire for immortal life that they tell other men beforehand that they are about to depart. No one hinders them. Instead, everyone thinks them happy and gives them letters to carry to familiar friends who are dead, so firmly and certainly do they believe that souls speak with one another in the other world. When these men have heard all the commands to be given them, they deliver their bodies to the fire. In order that their souls may be separated from their bodies in the greatest purity, they die amid hymns of praise made for them. Their dearest friends conduct them to death more readily than other people conduct their fellow citizens when they are going on a very long journey. Those friends weep for themselves, but regard the others as happy people who are soon to share in the immortal order of beings. Are we not ashamed, then, to have lower thoughts than the Indians, and by our own cowardice to cast a disgraceful reproach upon the laws of our country, which are so greatly desired and imitated by all mankind? Let's suppose that we had been brought up with a different belief and taught that life is the greatest good men can have, and that death is a calamity. Even then, the circumstances in which we now stand ought to move us to bear such a calamity courageously, since it is by the will of God, and by necessity that we are to die. It now appears that God has made this decree against the whole Jewish nation, that we are to be deprived of this life, which he knew we would not use properly. Do not ascribe the cause of our present condition to yourselves, and do not think that the Romans are the true reason this war with them has become so destructive to us all. These things have not happened by their power. A more powerful cause has intervened, and has given them the occasion to appear as conquerors over us. What Roman weapons, I ask you, killed the Jews at Caesarea? On the contrary, while they had no intention of rebelling, but were keeping their seventh-day festival, and did not even lift their hands against the citizens of Caesarea. Those citizens rushed upon them in great crowds and cut their throats, and the throats of their wives and children, without any regard even for the Romans themselves, who never considered us enemies until we revolted from them. Someone may say that the people of Caesarea had always quarreled with those who lived among them, and that when an opportunity came, they merely satisfied their old resentment against them. What then shall we say of those of Scythopolis, who dared to wage war against us for the sake of the Greeks? They did not act in revenge upon the Romans when they acted together with our countrymen. You see, therefore, how little our goodwill and faithfulness profited us, when they and their whole families were killed in the most inhuman manner. This was the whole repayment they received for the help they had given the others. The very destruction they had prevented from falling upon others they suffered from them, as though they themselves had been ready to act against them. It would take too long for me now to speak of every destruction brought upon us. You cannot fail to know that there was not one Syrian city that did not kill its Jewish inhabitants, and that they were more bitter enemies to us than the Romans themselves. Even those of Damascus, when they could offer no tolerable excuse against us, filled their city with the most barbarous slaughters of our people and cut the throats of 18,000 Jews, together with their wives and children. As for the multitude killed in Egypt, and killed with torments too, we have been informed that they were more than 60,000. Those Jews, being in a foreign country, and therefore naturally having nothing with which to resist their enemies, were killed in the manner just mentioned. But as for all of us who waged war against the Romans in our own country, did we not have sufficient reason for sure hopes of victory? We had arms, walls, and fortresses prepared so as not to be easily taken, and courage that could not be moved by any dangers in the cause of liberty. These things encouraged us all to revolt from the Romans. Yet these advantages helped us only for a short time, and only raised our hopes, while in truth they proved to be the beginning of our miseries. Everything we had has been taken from us. Everything has fallen under our enemies, as if these advantages existed only to make their victory over us more glorious, and were not arranged for the preservation of those who made such preparations. As for those already dead in the war, it is reasonable for us to regard them as blessed, because they died defending their liberty, not betraying it. But as for the multitude now under the Romans, who would not pity their condition? Who would not hurry to die before suffering the same miseries as they do? Some have been put on the rack and tortured with fire and whippings until they died. Some have been half devoured by wild beasts and yet kept alive to be devoured by them a second time, to provide laughter and sport for our enemies. Those still alive must be considered the most miserable of all, because they so greatly desire death and cannot reach it. And where now is that great city, the metropolis of the Jewish nation, fortified all around with so many walls, possessing so many fortresses and large towers to defend it, hardly able to contain the instruments prepared for war, and having so many tens of thousands of men to fight for it? Where is that city which was believed to have God himself dwelling within it? It has now been demolished to its very foundations, and has nothing preserved except one monument of it, the camp of those who destroyed it, still dwelling upon its ruins. Some unfortunate old men also lie upon the ashes of the temple, and a few women are kept alive there by the enemy for our bitter shame and reproach. Who can turn these things over in his mind and still bear to see the sun, even if he could live without danger? Who is so much an enemy of his country, or so unmanly and so eager to live, that he does not repent of being still alive? I cannot help wishing that we had all died before we saw that holy city demolished by the hands of our enemies, or the foundations of our holy temple dug up in so profane a manner. But since a generous hope deceived us, as though we might perhaps be able to avenge ourselves on our enemies for this, and since that hope has now become empty and has left us alone in this distress, let us hurry to die bravely. Let us pity ourselves, our children, and our wives while it is still in our power to show them pity. We were born to die, as were those whom we have begotten, and not even the happiest of our race can avoid it. But abuses, slavery, and the sight of our wives led away in disgrace with their children are not evils that are natural and necessary among men. Those who do not choose death before these miseries, when they have the power to do so, must suffer them because of their own cowardice. We revolted from the Romans with great claims to courage, and when at the very end they invited us to save ourselves, we would not comply with them. Who, therefore, will not believe that they will certainly be enraged at us if they can take us alive? Miserable will be the young men who are strong enough in body to endure many torments. Miserable also will be the older men, who will not be able to bear calamities that young men might sustain. One man will be forced to hear the voice of his son begging his father for help while his own hands are bound. But surely our hands are still free and have swords in them. Let them then serve us in our glorious design. Let us die before we become slaves under our enemies, and let us leave the world together with our children and our wives in a state of freedom. This is what our laws command us to do. This is what our wives and children ask from our hands. Indeed, God himself has brought this necessity upon us, while the Romans desire the opposite, and are afraid that any of us should die before we are taken.
There we leave them, the breach made, the fire taking hold, and Eliza's terrible argument hanging in the desert air. Next time, in the final part of the whole wars, part 35, that argument is answered, and Josephus brings us to the silent morning when the Romans climb the rock at last, and then to the very end of his history. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.